Gregory Fisher, and I am a spiritual counselor and a recovery coach. I have a master's in social work. I'm licensed as a advanced practice social worker, so LAPSW.
Mark Blakely, therapist. Uh,
So my name is William Feck. I have a education specialist degree, which is weird, but background in school counseling, which created a basically additional income, but comparable to a master's degree, but kind of one step above it in the education world. Licensed professional counselor with mental health service provider designation. That's different than you social workers. And then nationally certified counselor.
What is grief? Grief is the feeling most people either acknowledge or not after suffering a loss.
to me, grief is honoring the relationship I had with somebody that is no longer with me. And it's that mourning of the loss of the connection with them. To me, that's kind of like trying to describe what a color is to a blind person. Because grief is so different for each and every one of us, depending on the relationship we had with a person. The grief I may have for one family member would be totally different than the grief I have for another, and the circumstances. So I mean, it's on such a spectrum from, and the duality of it. I can be sad and happy as part of my grief.
There's a whole model for that. So, I mean, it can look like sadness, it can look like depression, it can look like anger. I think many people probably know the whole sadness part, isolating, not want to hang out with people, anhedonia, but confusion and anger are the ones that might not get explored the most, or people even recognizing like, oh, you're angry. You're angry because you lost someone and something that's very valuable to you. And typically with that anger, what's associated with that is blame. And so, do you need to address that? No. When it comes to anger, a lot of times when you're kind of assessing for anger, you also need to know where that's being targeted in terms of what to blame. I don't know if it's necessary, but I just know it's very common that people want to figure out who and what to blame. And so for some people it can be self-blame, very, very difficult to address when people blame themselves for the loss of something. People blame God, that gets into the whole bargaining or praying harder if you're concerned about losing someone or something that you haven't yet. But people can be angry at other people. So along with the anger, also looking at the blame part of that. Cool.
Thank you.
Boy, it looks like everything. Grief sometimes looks like substance abuse. Grief sometimes looks like going so dorsal vagal that you are a puddle on the floor. It looks like depression, or it can, but some people so overcompensate that it can look like one big party. So if we're saying, oh, look, that person's grieving, we might be surprised.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the model that kind of gives us a framework to operate from. I think that it's Kubler-Ross, I believe,
Yeah.
who I think she herself made the statement, people don't go through it in a linear fashion necessarily. People don't go through all the stages necessarily. It's just she was noticing a theme amongst many people. And so with anything, there are going to be exceptions to it. I think bargaining might be one of those where if people are grieving, you might not see that one play out in the way that you see other ones. Anger is another one, kind of going back to it. They might not feel or express the anger, and it's kind of a William Glasser concept of depression is restrained anger. So even in their depression of their grief, there might be underneath that restrained anger, and so you might not see it, but it's there. Yeah.
I think that way. I think it's cyclical. I think any day it can go one way or the other. I think, are those 5 things people experience? Yes. Do they experience all 5? Maybe. Do they experience more? Of course. You know, it's like all things. Like I used to teach to graduate students the DSM. You know, and at the beginning of every course, I would hold it up and say, "This is not the Bible. This is a textbook. It is like a dictionary, but it is not people's lives. It is not people's experience, and everything that's in here is only a starting point."
And some of them that stood out to us were the denial stage. And in this stage, clinically when treating it, is it helpful? And is it helpful to kind of push people through that stage, or to how do you best treat people in that?
When they're in that denial, it's really understanding, taking it from an IFS perspective, that there is a part of them that has kind of taken over and says, look, that loss is so great and the hurt is so much that right now it's too much for you. That part steps in and says, it didn't happen. It's not as bad, whatever that is. But that part is trying to protect self, and it's using that denial piece of it. It's not as bad as it is. It didn't happen. You know, what I believe is not true. And it's getting that part to step aside so self can really go through the grief and get through there. I can't force it, because the more I try to force that to step aside that part, the more it's going to dig in its heels. And they can be like, oh, that didn't happen. And I can have video proof and hard copy, here's all the proof. And they go still, because they're being forced, they won't accept it. But if I can just kind of work with them, why the fear of accepting that it did happen? How would things be different if you did accept it? And just let them pass through that journey on their own, because I'm just there to kind of help point out things.
Yeah. In your practice, what population do you see most of?
For me, where I work in addictions, and we operate from kind of a trauma-focused framework for why people develop addiction in the first place, which is from an affect regulation standpoint. So.
Okay. And within that population, what forms of grief do you see people dealing with?
The grief of their substance that they're giving up, yeah. So this is, I think, very helpful for people's kind of psychoeducation when it comes to when people have switched. It's kind of my theory coming out, but in addiction, typically the behavior, the substance, we'll just say alcohol to be easy, alcohol has become the attachment figure in and of itself. It has become the thing that instead of going to social support like a parent or a romantic partner, instead of going to them when I've had a rough day or when I'm in distress, I have a substance that I go to. And even from the attachment lens, it's if I'm having a rough day at work and I'm in distress, or I'm disappointed, or I've been rejected, because I know it's something that I can go to after work, that gives me some comfort to make it through the day. And from this place of the safe base of, I know it's there if I need it, so I can go to work, right? So it totally takes the place of an attachment figure. And so when we as therapists come in and we just say, oh, just stop drinking or give it up or whatever, get in sobriety, it's almost like taking away a person's parent or romantic partner in this sense, because that's the purpose that it served, an extreme amount of comfort and support. So along with sobriety, there's there's a very common grieving process that's associated with it.
Cool. Thank you. Could you touch on the bargaining piece of grieving?
Sure. Well, I think that the classic example is the whole bargaining with God of and this is typically in the case of people who might have a terminal illness and they know their time is limited, or at least anticipate that their time is limited. So you see such things as, oh God, if you save this person, I promise I'll be better, I'll start living right. This is more in association with someone else. People can do it for themselves as well, the same things, I promise I'll be better. But you typically see that associated with God or a higher power, because for many people as kind of constructs, God is the one who can both give life and take it away. And so typically people don't think in the sense of people having that amount of power, so they go to a higher power who has the ability to do that. I'm sure it can kind of get into potentially bargaining with people, but I've just not seen that play out as much in my practice.
Yeah.
I want to give them space to express and honor that relationship. I think a lot of times, especially in society, there's this concept, that we've got to be through the grief and we've got to get, I need to get over it and push on. And sometimes it's just giving people that space to express the relationship and to experience it without feeling judged and rushed and, you need to get over this, or you need to, take care of things. Just giving them the space to actually be, and just helping them to honor it.
Grieving.
Well, I think it's important to kind of pull from the Jewish culture in the sense of not just, appropriation or anything like that, but just notice that you have a whole culture that says you need to actually feel these emotions in community for several days. And so I think that that's a really culture to pull from, the sense of they're onto something, and that to fully gain some acceptance and to heal, you need time with it for the brain to kind of process what's happened. In the beginning, when people experience something, there's typically a profound sense of overwhelm and the brain can't cope, and it just simply needs time, because as emotions kind of decrease in intensity, kind of the brain's ability to make meaning of the event helps to change drastically. So the more intense your emotions, the less you can kind of make sense of something. And not that that's necessarily required that you make sense of it, but what's also very helpful with people's healing and acceptance is some kind of meaning being put to it, like they're in a better place, life can go on, I have other people. And even me saying that, it's not something I would encourage you to try to put meaning to them, because that's almost invalidating what they're going through and not very helpful. But people who are healing, and I've seen them in that acceptance change, that state, I hear them saying things like that. They've assigned a meaning to it, that meaning or those cognitions or schemas are bringing with them a tremendous amount of healing and peace about the situation.
Thank you,
Compassion. Really compassion, all day, every day. From the clinical standpoint, and here's what is interesting about compassion. First, for myself. Compassion for my own suffering. Compassion for the way that I might be identifying with what my client is dealing with. So compassion. And then compassion for them. If I'm not, as a clinician, if I'm not coming from a place of compassion, I should go get a different job.
What is the best way to support a friend, a loved one who is grieving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, kind of in the same thing that I was saying of how people try to put meaning to their experiences, and I don't see that as ever helpful, of you saying, oh, they're in a better place or anything like that. I would really shy away from you inserting your meaning about the situation with someone's life. And I just really think that the brain is, whatever your belief systems are, programmed or evolved, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. We need other people while we heal. And grief is overwhelming no matter who you are. And it's one of those things where don't try to heal from grief in isolation. You need community, you need a village, you need people. And the brain, just having someone else in the room to kind of feel your emotions with you, one of the most healing things that you can do. So honestly, if I could say it simply and directly, kind of just shut up and just be with them and let them feel your presence as they experience their grief. It's really not about what you say, because people put so much weight into, I gotta have the right response or say the right thing when someone's sharing with me or with them. And really, people just need to feel your presence and just feel it with them. And that's when the brain can, kind of those innate healing mechanisms can kick in and just be able to process those overwhelming emotions.
I hate giving advice. That what you feel is not wrong. Don't rush it. Just be in it. It's important. That person meant something to you, and it really honors them to mourn their loss and that loss of connection with them.
Cool. Well, you had to give one piece of advice or something to say to someone that was dealing with grief right now. What would that be?
Compassion towards what you're feeling. People often try to actually put a time limit on it, and as much as research can help us as clinicians to know what's kind of the norm and what's a deviation from the norm, I think it's good for us. But if you're going through it, don't you start Googling, when should I be over this, or what do I do? Just, for one, get yourself in a community that supports you, that can be with you, and allow yourself, whatever you're feeling, it's okay. And I think what you feel towards what you're feeling can really determine whether you suffer or not through the process.